to Belling History with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington in the fourth corner of these United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the PNW. We are your hosts. I'm Colby.
And I'm Ren, and we are co-owners of Belling History Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about our tour business, visit our website at bellinghistory.com. Today, we have yet another re-release episode from our Bad Town Season 2 of the City of Subdued Podcast, which was hosted by Annika Fleming and Dalla Gasparina, and co-hosted by us, as well as our founding mother, Marissa McGrath. We recorded these episodes back in 2020 during the old pandemic, so if you haven't heard them before, they are some of our favorite bad Belling history tales. They're true crime and stories from the dark side. If you've already heard them, listen again, maybe, or, hang on until spring when we have a lovely, amazing season planned for all of you guys.
Yes, we're going to be working hard all winter, and we will comment at the end of a lot of these. We're adding our little updates and 2 cents from 2023, so even if you have listened before, you might get something new.
It's true, because we love you.
So today's episode is called Bad Lady Town, or as I like to call it, Female Trouble.
Mm-hmm. Could mean anything. Yeah, this week's episode is a salute to the fairer sex and the ovaries it took to survive out here in the fourth corner. Often, women's history is an afterthought, and many of the stories of history are told by men. So to illustrate the lives of women in our town is to make the picture more whole. And we take that mission pretty damn seriously around here. So allow us to introduce you to the ladies of Bad Town.
Yes, and again, this is our Bad Town series, so we've got dark history, true crime, and this one delves into what happens to women who ran afoul of the law, specifically. So we will let you listen, and then we did have some bonus questions about this episode that we'll add on at the end. And then we'll be back to add some additional thoughts and updates for some of the characters in this one.
Sounds good.
All right, let's listen.
Hello and welcome to Bad Town, where we discuss the darkest and the baddest parts of Bellingham and Whatcom County history. We are joined today, as always, by our Season 2 co-host, Colby Labrie.
Howdy do.
And Ren Urbikite.
Oh, hello.
From the Good Time Girls. So, what story are you telling me about today?
Today's episode we have deemed Female Trouble. And basically, we're going to sum that up as the baddest bitches in Bad Town.
I'm glad you liked that.
Yes.
I was like, alliteration. I love it.
Yeah.
Anyway, Female Trouble. And it's interesting because it sometimes feels like we end up with less stories about women, or they just have less details, or it's harder to find press. It seems like we end up with tons and tons of stories about crimes committed by men. And, so we have all these bad boys of Bad Town, and the women's stories can sometimes kind of feel lost or drowned out. So we kind of wanted to highlight some of our favorite ladies. And we know there are sexual differences and gender differences in rates of likelihood of committing crimes, of types of crimes committed, even being victims of crimes. And there's a lot of debate as to what the reasons are for these sociological theories, biological, sociobiological. It's complicated, right? And probably a little of all the above. It gets a little depressing telling stories in which women are the victims of crime, which seems to be incredibly repetitive. But I argue that you could also say that in some of our stories where they are so-called criminals or perpetrators of crime, they're actually victims as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess just before we start Colby and I both wanted to just acknowledge we're talking about female trouble here, and but we want to make sure that we acknowledge that we fully believe in the fluidity of gender, and that the word female can be used to identify with more than just your reproductive organs. But it's worth reminding folks that during this time, the time periods and the places, the stories we are telling are set, the whole culture was much more rigidly divided by biological sex and or your public presentation of gender. There were sometimes you could pass, but for those who could, but it was rare. It was still within a really very binary system of gender that was perpetuated by these Europeans and Euro-American colonizers. So with that, I guess we should also acknowledge the history we are discussing is largely Euro-American, and the immigrants and colonizers who came to this area in the very recent past, with the first so-called settlers to the area arriving about 170-ish years ago. And that's compared to the Coast Salish tribes and the other tribal groups and their ancestors like the Lummi Nation and the Nooksacks, who lived on this land for 10,000 plus years before those so-called settlers brought their Euro-American problems and crimes. But when they did, like we said, a lot of men were in the press about that, but women had their role to play in that too.
Saying, oh, yes, they did.
They did.
Yes.
Those Euro-Americans, they brought plenty of their Euro-American problems.
Untold amounts.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, I don't know, you guys ready to get into it?
Yeah,
Yes.
let's do it.
All right. So one of the earliest crimes committed here by those Euro-American settlers was one that was pretty sensational in the area at the time. And I don't think just for its time, but even now, I think it's pretty dramatic. But it occurred in 1880, so pretty early on in the days of old Bellingham. And that's the story of Mrs. Susan Clark. And she was sentenced for the murder of Michael Padden, whose name you might recognize, Lake Padden. That is for whom Lake Padden is named. And he was shot. He was actually a foreman of the Seaholm coal mine, and he was actually shot by Susan's 10-year-old son, Thomas Clark Jr. And it was reportedly at her insistence. So mom told the son to head on down there with a shotgun. So apparently these families had been feuding over this property survey, and Susan was pretty pissed off because she thought that Mr. Padden was kind of cheating them on some of their land, and there had been this dispute over it. And finally, Padden was down there building a fence on what he thought was his land, and Mrs. Clark sent her son down to shoot him. Eventually, Mrs. Clark was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in the pen, but before she could serve that time, she hung herself in her cell. Luckily, the son, the case was dismissed against him, but really just a tragic and sad story really early on.
Damn. What was it like if a woman got arrested and sent to jail or was sent to prison?
Yeah, it seems there wasn't really any kind of system set up specifically to handle women prisoners in any organized way across the board, from little small city and county jails to territorial and state prisons. Just because there weren't as many women committing crimes, there wasn't as many women there in the first place. There was a much smaller population who was very heavily weighted on the male end. So you had McNeil Island, which opened in 1875. Was a federal penitentiary. And now that's some kind of special correction facility for sexual predators. Weirdly, they just abandoned the old prison. I think it might be the creepiest island on Earth. I was just reading about it, so I got kind of intrigued.
My parents, you can see it from like their house.
Really?
Almost. You have to walk a little ways because they're not.
Yeah.
But yeah,
crazy.
It's like right
yeah.
there. Yeah.
I wonder, like, they must not just let anybody go there. So
Yeah. It looks like you could swim across, though.
I mean, people must have. Some people escaped. It was kind of like Alcatraz-y, being on an island and everything. Anyway, Susan Clark, though, wasn't sent there. She was sent to Seatco, which is in the town that's now called Bucoda, Washington. And they had built an early for-profit prison there. And it had no accommodations for women, of course. And so they had to put her, they basically like made a makeshift spot for her in the shoe/tailor shop/hospital. And this prison was notorious. Like, it was the conditions there that created a public demand for a state prison. It was referred to as hell on earth back in those days. And the town of Seattle actually changed their name because of the horrible reputation of the prison. And the word Seattle is actually supposed to be a native word meaning haunted place or devil place.
Hell yeah.
I know. I was immediately like, okay, road trip. Gonna go there too. Although I guess nothing's left of the prison. And then you got Walla Walla State Pen, which opened in 1886, which was 3 years before Washington became a state. That was also, still is, technically a men's prison. And I love some of its nicknames, including The Walls and Concrete Mama.
Ooh.
I learned there are currently 12 adult prisons in Washington state, and only 2 of those are for women, and that there were no all-women's prisons prior to 1970. So up till that time, they were just making it up and whatever. They were always just coming up with some makeshift thing. And at local levels, it was the same exact thing. You had really a wide variety of like county and city jails, and none were equipped for women. I can't really speak for all of them, but definitely in the early days of Bellingham and the towns on the bay, again, it was just no accommodation for women because not many were getting arrested, outnumbered by men. And things like prostitution were tolerated and legally sanctioned. So no one was getting arrested for that. And then there were, the occasional murder, manslaughter cases like Susan Clark. And a lot of those stemmed from domestic violence situations. Mm-hmm. But anyway, jails were pretty much totally makeshift. They even used repurposed weird buildings and structures for male prisoners. You would often hear jails referred to as the calaboose. And even they're like labeled that on old maps of the town. Like, here's the calaboose, which is so Wild Westy. It's some kind of bastardization of some Spanish term meaning jail or something.
Huh. So what do we know about early Bellingham jails?
Well, like Colby said, these early jails were super makeshift. In fact, Fairhaven used an abandoned old boat hull or a barge as a jail, which they jokingly called the Hotel de McGinty. And depressingly, they named it after a man who had drowned himself after losing at poker.
Depressingly or perfectly? Like, I don't know.
They're like, this one's for you, old McGinney.
Pour one out for McGinty.
In the jail.
Oh, now it is depressing.
Okay, I'm glad you guys have come around on that.
Yeah.
So for a time, the jail in the city of Bellingham was in the basement of the territorial courthouse building on E Street, that old brick building. But during the boom years of the 1890s, the town of New Whatcom commissioned the new City Hall on Prospect Street in an attempt to look fancier than their rival town of Fairhaven. So the basement of that building was to be the new city jail. And everybody, I hope, knows what we're talking about here when we say that the old City Hall, the big, giant, fancy red building. So anyway, when New Whatcom and Fairhaven grew together and united as Bellingham in 1903, there was a population boom. And as the town grew, so did the population of criminals. And it didn't take long for the new Bellingham City Jail to become crowded and disgusting and dirty. In the winter months, it was reported that 25 to 40 men would be crammed into this space, which was meant for 4 to 6 men.
Nope.
Smells lovely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I bet it smelled real good down there.
Oh, God.
So there was, speaking of women, there was a solitary cell, which they used for those random women prisoners. And it was described as a very small room with one filthy mattress lacking in ventilation.
No.
So eventually the conditions were so bad that a judge refused to sentence any women to the jail, calling it not fit for human habitation.
Sorry, dudes. You don't count.
Sorry.
Just lowly criminals.
Yeah, just vermin. So women were constantly just being released because they really just didn't have anywhere to put them. But in 1907, they moved the judge's quarters upstairs and created a makeshift kind of women's ward in his old rooms. But because it had standard walls, where the rest of the jail had brick or stone, the police chief really worried that, quote, an irate woman armed with a bedpost could easily smash her way out of jail.
He's not wrong. Show me the lie.
Although, actually, I have no record. I've never found any records of a woman breaking out of jail, except for when they just walked out. So somehow they could get away with just being like, yeah, I'm just going to go out here for a minute. Bye. But no, like, chiseling out or anything like that.
Yeah.
Got it.
Smashing out with bedposts. I wish.
Sounds like they didn't have to.
Yeah.
But so after whiskey bottles were found down there in the women's ward in about 1909, the jailers kind of lamented the need to put heavy screens over the barred windows. So there were apparently bars, but nothing stopping someone from the outside handing stuff in through the outside of the jail.
So good.
I know. I'm like, were the windows just open? God, that'd be freezing.
Lord, no thank you. So, yeah, I was also concerned, again, due to potential breakouts. And then there's another fun quote. A woman handy with a hammer and saw, both of which could be smuggled in through the windows, would have no trouble in demolishing the side of the jail wall and making her escape. They were really concerned about these, like, crazy ladies.
Meanwhile, they just walked out the front door.
I know. Yeah. Actually, we do have a story that we're going to tell you later about a woman who was arrested for attempting to aid men in breaking out of a jail. But before we get to that, we want to talk about the police matrons.
Oh, the police matrons. That's so matronly.
I know, right? I had to look up what exactly is the definition of matron, and it basically is either a married, mature, or elderly woman, or B, a woman in charge of children or other women, such as at a boarding school or a women's jail. So, yeah, you had to be, matronly. Basically, it was considered, untoward to have male policemen handling women prisoners. It was actually created by the demands of women and women's groups who lobbied for this and to have women on the department to handle women prisoners. The men had no problem with the system. So if we recall, we've probably talked about this before, that in 1909, a group of prominent men formed the Municipal League with the goal of cleaning up the town. At this time period, there was also groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and others who were really concerned with like getting rid of all the Wild West vice. And it was that environment in which a woman named Miss Ella Bellia, I love that. She petitioned the city to create the position on the police force. And she had been working with the newly organized YWCA, and she had made it her mission to intercept young women arriving at the train station to make sure they didn't fall into the wrong line of employment or the wrong rooming house. A legitimate concern, given the red light district was directly across the tracks from the station. But the city agreed to create the position. However, no one else applied. And so therefore, Ella Bellia became the first woman to fill the position.
I don't know why I keep thinking of like House Bunny, even though it's not House Bunny. But that's what I keep thinking of.
I don't think it was that much fun.
No, I don't think it was either at all.
Yeah, it clearly wasn't that much fun. So all those like moral crusaders were agitating, and the city was convinced to close down the red light district. And right around that same time, the local option law was passed. And so essentially in 1910, Bellingham, got rid of the brothels, got rid of the booze all at one time. And the police suddenly had their hands full to overflowing with criminals of all sexes and sorts, because you've just criminalized a very large proportion of your population. Yeah. So women were suddenly being arrested in much larger numbers, mostly for liquor violations. And Ella Bellia, she only stayed around for about a year before she left for the East Coast to be an orphanage superintendent, because that's way more fun.
Oh, Ella Bellia. It feels like to me it like reminds me of Mrs. Pigglewiggle or something.
I know, or Amelia Bedelia.
Amelia Bedelia, yes. They replaced Ella. I can't even say it. It's like a tongue
I know.
twister. They replaced her with Miss Edith Fuller. And she was a former kindergarten teacher who lived with her aged mother, I should say. No sooner had Edith been hired than the city of Bellingham declared the need for budget cutbacks, and this matron position was on the line. And the city was having a really hard time, as we said, adjusting to this enormous loss of revenue from saloon licenses and the fees paid by the working girls in the red light district. So, along with the need to increase policing and jailing of these new criminalized populations, they're dealing with a huge loss in revenue. So, women's groups such as the YWCA demanded the retention of this matron position. However, Edith left on her own after she was offered a better paying job by the Yakima Police Department. But the Bellingham Police Department declared that they had no inclination to hire a replacement matron, since they had already had 2 men on voluntary leave of absence. So, yeah, it's just getting worse. And the police chief McFadden lamented the conditions of the overly taxed jail, saying, quote, "The city jail contains more prisoners than the laws of man ever intended it to accommodate. Bugs are rampant. The female quarters are punk. The prisoners cannot take a bath unless Fire Chief Marsh souses them with the gasoline-driven joy wagon," or a fire engine. "Or unless they're tied to a rope and keel-hauled from the outmost point of the Seaholm dock."
Oh my God.
I just cannot. Just throw somebody into the old bay.
This article sounds like somebody's like drunk uncle at dinner.
I'm sorry.
I would be happy just not to take a bath if those were my options.
I'll just smell.
I'm good. Just smelling. I like the flies. It's protein.
Oh, you say that now, but on day like 12, you're going to be looking for anyone to throw you off the Seaholm dock.
I rope my ankle and throw me in.
Or hose me down with the fire hose.
So again, after all this, the women's groups voiced their demands for a police matron again, and the city soon finally persuaded Edith Fuller to come back and resume the job, and they were going to offer her some better pay. But Edith's job not only involved dealing with these female prisoners, she was also this protective officer and expected to keep young women out of trouble in the first place. So Edith continued Ella Bellia's efforts at intercepting women at the train station, as well as inspecting these theaters and dance halls for any hanky-panky or lewd movie pictures. So Edith's initial assessment of the situation in Bellingham, her first little foray into the lives of the young women in Bellingham, produced some dire results that she posted in the Herald. And she said that 50% of girls were, quote, deceiving their mothers.
No, she just made that statistic up.
She's like, half the girls in this town are sneaking around. Parents, what are you doing?
So she's basically blaming parents for being too lax and telling them that their girls are out there on the town. Another thing Edith did when she was censoring, she needed help censoring those movie pictures we were talking about, and was supposedly planning to deputize pretty girls to help quell the masher nuisance by arresting any man who paid them unwanted attentions.
Okay, so what is a masher nuisance exactly?
I know, let's unpack the mashers. So basically, mashers were kind of a slang term for men who sexually harassed women.
Oh yeah, let's bring this one back. I kind of like it.
Right?
I know.
You did the monster mash. Sorry. Halloween.
So mashers was the common term used between the 1880s and the 1930s. Basically, as soon as women had the freedom to go into public and urban environment unescorted, they encountered sexual harassment from strange men. So there's a Stanford history professor, Estelle Friedman. She wrote in her 2013 book, Redefining Rape, Sexual Violence in the Era of Suffrage and Segregation. And she says, quote, "The revolt against the masher signaled an important transition in American women's public lives. It was parallel to the quest for full citizenship as voters. The call for safety to travel alone meant greater access to both labor and leisure. Women recognized that street harassment impeded their mobility and marked them as intruders on historically male space. During this time, long, sharp hat pins came into vogue. There are many, many stories of women, being groped or harassed by these mashers and just pulling out their hat pin and stabbing them.
And their parasols,
Their
bashing
parasols,
them.
yeah.
I love that. Weaponizing whatever they had on hand.
Yeah.
Okay, this is making me think of one of those pop culture references where the really buff fighter dude is like, my arms are registered in 8 countries as lethal weapons. Except instead of arms, they're like hat pins and parasols.
Chuck Norris, I'm sure. I know. She whips it out, does some crazy nunchuck moves. I love it. So Edith, she actually got some recognition though for her protective work nationwide. They got inquiries about her methods, her system for troubled girls, which was basically hey, maybe we don't throw them in the disgusting ass jail. So instead she would get girls to be cared for in the house of a Christian woman who would look after them as a mother would. And if they didn't shape up, they were quietly sent away to some good training school, which, isn't great, but maybe was better than being in the jail with all the gross men. So her goal was, quote, to cause the girls to see the error of their ways without the publicity of a trial, and in this way to lift them up to a higher plane, to cause them to regain their self-respect and to live a clean and moral life. Despite all her efforts and great results, the city jail was still receiving fallen women with alarming regularity. So she continued to agitate for better conditions in the jail. And in 1913, thanks to her, the women's ward got a private lavatory, which was a toilet and a sink, cold water only. The jail reportedly at the time housed 6 women in a space designed for 2. And there was a cement floor damp from water seepage. So she got a wooden floor installed and sleeping accommodations for 3 people. So she also got them a heater and some access to hot water finally, which was provided by the chief, bringing it in buckets. So in 1921, budget cuts again put her position on the line. And again, ladies of the town wrote a letter to the editor and demanded, that her position be retained. And I like this quote, "It seems impossible to believe that anyone familiar with the nature and quality of our present police matron's work would favor a reduction of her meager salary. Her work necessarily is unknown to the general public, but nevertheless is highly efficient. Her beat is the entire city and her shift many times more than 8 hours. She has been offered similar positions in other cities at better salaries." Yeah, she was the lowest paid position on the force. I don't know if we mentioned that, but I'm just going to repeat that again. And she did remain on the force for 5 more years until she retired in 1926. She was 49 years old and she was recently married to a widower.
So what happened with the women's jail after Edith left?
After Edith left the city, they hired Mrs. Charlotte E. Strong. And her name suited her. She looks like one tough broad. In fact, in 1932, it was announced that she was the, quote, second best gunner on the force. She beat out all but one officer in her marksmanship scores. So Strong takes over, and in 1932, as Prohibition wound down, the small room used as a liquor vault was made over into a padded cell. Despite clearing out the booze and presumably fewer alcohol-related arrests, the jail was still squeezed for space. With accommodations for 8 to 10 prisoners maximum, overflow prisoners were regularly sent to the county jail, and women who were jailed still lacked access to bathing facilities. So in 1938, WPA funds made possible the construction of the new City Hall on Lottie Street with larger modern jail facilities. And when the new building opened in December of 1939, the new jail had, quote, modern roomy quarters with air conditioning, an inner office communication system, and an actual kitchen. There were 6 cells for men, 2 for women, 2 for juveniles, and 1 padded cell.
It doesn't sound that much bigger, honestly.
No.
I'm like, what?
Of course, the shiny new jail, as we said, didn't stay cushy for very long, and that overcrowding and poor conditions in the city jail have been a continuous problem over the years, and budgets never seem to be enough to improve things.
Maybe mass incarceration isn't really like a great idea, and like you can never, it's just this whole system does not seem sustainable. You'll never have big enough jails.
Especially if you make like stupid shit illegal.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems like resources, put resources into things that would keep people from doing stupid crimes in the first place, maybe. I feel like better things we could divert some funding into, but it's just the way the whole thing's set up.
Yeah, I was going to say, why do that when we can make money off of them?
Right.
That's the spirit.
Welcome to Bad Town.
So who were some of the most infamous women prisoners that we have in our Bellingham history books?
One of my favorites is probably our only, quote, famous or infamous women prisoner is Emma Goldman, who is kind of a personal idol of mine. But if you don't know who Emma Goldman is, you need to go out and get yourself down an internet rabbit hole. Stat. Okay. In December of 1908, the Bellingham jail hosted the, quote, high priestess of anarchy.
Ooh.
So Emma Goldman was a writer and lecturer on anarchist philosophy, women's rights, and social issues. She dedicated her entire life to the idea of creating a radically new social order because she believed our society and economic systems were fundamentally unjust. Yeah, she was ahead of her time. And I just have to throw in this quote from the Jewish Women's Archives online because they said it so beautifully. Goldman's deep commitment to the ideal of absolute freedom led her to espouse a wide range of controversial causes. A fiery orator and a gifted writer, she became a passionate advocate of freedom of expression, sexual freedom and birth control, equality and independence for women, radical education, union organization, and workers' rights. Support for these ideas, many of which were unpopular with mainstream America, earned Goldman the enmity of powerful political and economic authorities, known as exceedingly dangerous, and one of the 2 most dangerous anarchists in America. She was often harassed or arrested while lecturing, and sometimes banned outright from speaking, insisting on the right to express herself in the face of overwhelming odds. Goldman became a prominent figure in the establishment of the right to freedom of speech in America. Badass in a nutshell.
Damn.
So she was on a speaking tour of the West and was scheduled to speak at the Bellingham Theater. Again, this is 1908. Mayor DeMattos, at the time, he was not having any of it, and he ordered her to be arrested on the charge of attempting to incite a riot before she even spoke. So she was arrested as soon as she showed up, and she spent the night in jail. Her bond was fixed at $5,000, which was not a small amount at the time, and she was ordered to leave the next day. Fred, do you want to start the next story about a bad girl from Bad Town?
Yeah, I can do that. We wanted to talk about Madame Myrtle Baker, which some of you might have heard of on our tours. And she is one of our favorite lady criminals. She was a local madam. And these women had worked their way up, these madams had worked their way up the sex work hierarchy and became property owners and business managers. And their presence was tolerated, if not encouraged, in these early years as a necessary evil in a place with a population that skewed heavily on the dirty bachelor male side of things. So as we mentioned before, with the pressures from groups like the Municipal League to shut down the red light district increasing, these women faced legal charges more and more. Myrtle Baker was one of the madams who got a lot of press at this time. She ran the Melville House or Melville Cottage at the corner of D and Chestnut Streets, which was on pilings over the tide flats at the time. Her first warrant of arrest that we found actually occurred in 1906 and was because Sam Lowe, whom she employed as her cook, was busted with opium, and she was charged with allowing the use of dope in her house. And when When the Municipal League forced the town to crack down on the red light district in 1910, it appears the police actually tipped off all of the ladies in the red light district, and most of the employees left town on trains. But being property holders, several of these madams remained behind, including Myrtle Baker and her rival, Eva Holman.
All right, so this is from the Bellingham Herald, April 1st, 1910, which was the deadline for the closure of the red light district. And the headline read, "Women fold their tents and fade away." So it reads, Eva Holman and Myrtle Baker, once mistresses of a bright and popular district, now hold undisputed sway in a dark, dismal, and tenantless domain. As property owners, they stand on their rights, but they stand alone. Bowing to the inevitable, the will of the church and reform factions of the city, the former inmates of the red light district near the Great Northern Depot have themselves solved the problem by moving out. The women of the district have gone to more lucrative fields, and the district, which in former days was gaily lighted, will tonight be all dark.
It's beautiful.
I know. According to the statements of some of the residents of the district, a police official visited them yesterday afternoon and issued a warning for all to vacate today. Who that official was and what authority he had for such action cannot be determined, as both the mayor and the chief of police state emphatically that no one carried such a message from them. However, the exodus from the district began this morning, and every train out of the city carried a number of the residents. Eva Holman and Myrtle Baker, the two principal property owners in the former district, will make their homes there until such time as they are able to find more suitable dwellings. Both are big property holders in this city, and both have paid taxes here for a number of years. And while neither evince any intention of continuing her former occupation, both deny the right of anyone to drive them out of the city or away from their own property as long as they live within the letter of the law. An investigation of the district by police this afternoon brought forth a statement at the police station that the erstwhile red light district is now no more.
Except, or so they hoped. But Myrtle apparently kept right on with business. And she was arrested again in August of that year. After the Municipal League heard she was keeping on, or they went undercover and they turned her in. Got another fun Herald article from 1910, August. They say Myrtle Baker and Annie Wells were arrested on charges of maintaining body houses. Both of the landladies seemed to have plenty of money and gave cash bonds to assure their appearance in court. The Baker woman is charged with maintaining a house of ill fame, commonly known as a bawdy house, in the old restricted district, and the Wells woman has been living on the corner of Railroad Avenue and Chestnut Street over the Cottage Bar. In the early part of this year, the Municipal League demanded of the city officials that the restricted district near the Great Northern Depot be abolished, and the red lights that have glared there for so many years were doused under the direction of the city police. When the women were driven from their quarters on the flats, they spread out over the city and infested the lodging houses. About 2 months ago, the Reform League heard reports that indicated that the conditions in the city were not yet what they should be. A committee was appointed to do some gumshoe work, with the result that information was secured, which was placed in the hands of the prosecuting attorney. The filing of the information against the landladies is the result of the actions of the executive board of the Municipal League. So, yeah, the Municipal League had members volunteer to go undercover, quote unquote, to get information on where the brothels were operating, and turn that into the police, forcing arrests.
So brave of them.
It's almost like the police, were like reluctant to do so until their hands were forced. But Myrtle, she failed to appear at her trial after this whole thing, and it was said that she was somewhere in California, which is where she was from, and she had family there. And while she was gone, her husband, Silas Baker, who's basically a town drunk, and he had the keys to her brothel and was busy selling her stock of booze to all his buddies. So we have another great little Herald quote here. French Pete, notable celebrity of Old Town, sauntered out of the Melville cottage on the flats in the old Badlands district this morning at 10 o'clock with a bottle of beer on his hip, fell into the arms of Detectant Tom Nugent, is now being held as a material witness in the city jail, along with a wagon load of beer, whiskey, and champagne. So he's charged with maintaining a nuisance and engaging in the unlawful sale of liquors. So Myrtle, upon her return, she has to face charges and then this mess on top of it, which she ends up taking the heat for. And it says in the article reporting on that, Myrtle Baker, charged with vagrancy, arraigned before Judge Kellogg in Superior Court. The specific complaint against Miss Baker was that she was running a house of prostitution near the Great Northern Depot. She was also arrested for the unlawful sale of intoxicating liquor, but as she furnished her $1,000 bond and said, I will not violate that law again all year, they were like, okay, we won't charge you with anything. And her husband, though, who was the one who got busted selling her booze, was also arraigned, and he pled not guilty. And because his physical condition was poor, because of his excessive use of intoxicating liquors, they were just like, we're not going to press charges. So she's taking the heat for her alcoholic husband who was selling her booze. I just imagine her being so pissed at him at this point.
So pissed. You dead man.
It gets worse, though.
Later that year, Myrtle goes to California again. And while she's gone, old hubby Silas got up to trouble with her rival, Madame Eva Holman. And when she returned unexpectedly, she caught them both dining together and proceeded to clock Silas on the head with a ketchup bottle and cause a big scene in the cafe where they were sitting.
One of the 57 bottles, right?
Yeah. It's gotta be. So Silas agreed to leave town if the police would escort him to get his things from Myrtle's property, and the police happily obliged. Myrtle then sought a divorce, stating he was a habitual drunkard and that she was the sole provider for the family. I know we're reading our fair share of headlines. This one is about that whole incident from December 15th, 1911, and the headline reads, Silas Baker is on the way to Peaceful Town.
Did he die? I don't know.
His former husband, intimidated by ketchup bottle in hands of erstwhile spouse, promises the police he will hit the pike if they will help him get his clothes. So good. But he does say, quote, but I want someone to go to the house with me and help me get my clothes. Myrtle Baker is some scrapper. Accept it from me, and she'll certainly go to me right if I go to the house alone. He's terrified of Myrtle.
I know. I love how they made these little quotes that are supposedly by him.
Yeah, I know. Do you think they really were? Are they?
I'm sure it was some poetic license on the part of the newspaper. I'm sure he said something. I imagine also he was wasted. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says, quote, I certainly want someone to go in the house with me to get my things. Then I'll leave and I'll never come back. That's a bargain, added Captain Callahan. If you will agree to go and never come back, I will back you up if all the fighting ladies in North America were after you. It's worth the risk.
Bye, loser.
Bye, Silas. They waved goodbye at the depot. Never to be seen again.
Not for long, though. He came back.
He goes back. Of course he does.
Do we know any more of Myrtle's story?
Well, her story doesn't end well, as badass as she was. She died 2 short years later in California of tuberculosis. So one of the hazards of the profession, I'd say. She had deeded her property to her sister in California right before her death, which is kind of how we know a lot about her, because being a property owner and also deeding her property to her sister and just being in the paper all the time with these great shenanigans makes her one of our more well-documented madams. And like I said, her husband, Silas, apparently came back to Bellingham and just kept on being the town drunk because you keep getting stories about him after her death. Wah wah. Our next bad girl is Georgia Allen, who I believe Marissa had taken photos of Walla Walla State Prison records when she visited, I think it was the archives in Olympia, and there weren't a ton of women in these mugshots. And in fact, one really stuck out because she was also arrested in Bellingham. And I think that was the only one that we found. And so I kind of stashed her aside as something I wanted to look into later. I just want to talk about her mugshot. This is in 1912. I mean, you could tell she's probably not wealthy or fancy, but she's got these little like spectacles on a chain. And, you know, at my first glance, I was like, oh, like she looks like a librarian or something. But then you read the stats that accompany, you know, her intake information. She has an alias, for one. That's interesting. She's only 19 years old. Her alias is Gypsy Cameron. But she was born and native to Canada, and her crime was aiding prisoner to escape. So this is what I love. She has a red and blue tattoo of clasped hands on a heart and a wreath on her outer left bicep. And then on her outer right bicep, she has, this is all one tattoo, a U.S. flag, British Union Jack, rising sun, and arrowhead. Which I don't know. I'm like curious if that represents like her ethnicity or her family background or something, because those are flags, and rising sun is like Empire of Japan. Arrowhead could be, you know, some native. I don't know. I have no idea. So her crime was attempting to smuggle guns and saws to these two dope smugglers so that they could escape from the Whatcom County Jail. And I just wanted to quickly talk about the Whatcom County Jail, because this is different than the city jail that we talked about previously in the basement of Old City Hall / the museum. So the county jail doesn't exist anymore. And it was a creepy Hogwarts-looking sandstone castle of a building on G and Ellsworth Street. I have a picture of it there if you guys want to look at it. But it was built about the same time, a little earlier actually than the city hall and jail. And it's where Fouts Park is, behind North Coast Credit Union. Yeah, so the county jail was serving the entire county, right? So this was the courthouse for the entire county, and the jail, and all the county administration was in this one building. Ren, do you want to read the amazing article about Georgia Allen?
Yeah, gladly. Quote, "One of the most daring schemes ever attempted here to secretly carry aid to prisoners in jail was halted last night when Sheriff Thomas took the precaution to search a young woman who claimed to be a sister of George Kidd upon her request to communicate with her brother and his accomplice, Paul Webster, arrested last Wednesday on the charge of smuggling opium into the United States. Hidden in the bosom of the young woman's dress were a .38 caliber revolver loaded and a box of cartridges. From her stockings, the officers extracted a dozen new steel saws and a bottle of oil used in the operation of sawing steel bars. Apparently, the oil was to help permit the saws to bite the steel. The young woman, who is of prepossessing appearance, arrived Friday with a permit from the U.S. warden at Seattle and asked for permission to talk with her brother. Permission was granted, and she left the jail alone. Tonight, she returned but had no permit, and before the sheriff would allow her to enter the jail, he told her she must submit to a search. She then told the officers she would defer her visit until her sister arrived. However, the search was to be made anyway, and she said, "Well, I have the goods all right, and may as well hand them over." She then gave her name as Georgia Allen and said her home was in Vancouver, BC. She was detained on charges of carrying concealed weapons and attempting to offer aid to prisoners.
Okay, you guys, I'm sorry, but I just like, this takes some freaking ovaries, right? Like a dozen saws,
right?
So do you think she was wearing a disguise or something? Maybe that's why she looked so...
I know. They're like, she's really comely or whatever. She's not hot. I don't know.
Yeah, she looked like Mrs. Trunchbull from Matilda.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I'm just trying to figure out how big these saws are. I mean, a dozen in her stockings.
I know.
And not have them be like completely obviously clank, clank, clank. I mean, maybe that's why she got caught. I don't know. I suspect, though, it was probably like less bravery and more desperation, as it would appear she was a fan of opium, which the men were smuggling. A lot of the articles mention she was beholden to one of the men and was just returning the favor. I think one of the articles said the men befriended her when she was, quote, up against it, which I think is a pretty interesting way of being like, yeah, this woman was an addict and was probably dope sick. So these guys, though, they had like more than $1,000 worth of opium in their possession when they were arrested. And they were believed to be part of some kind of organized gang. And because they were federal prisoners because of crossing borders and smuggling, she was facing a pretty steep situation here. And it was said that she maintained an air of indifference during the proceedings until the sentence of 1 to 10 years was passed, when she collapsed. So George Kidd, who I think it was the one that she said was her brother, but was not at all, he was sentenced to 8 months, got out in 6. And Webster, I think, had prior convictions. So he was sentenced to 2 years and like a $500 fine. And both of those guys served at McNeil Island, the federal penitentiary. And I'm not exactly sure why Georgia got sent to Walla Walla instead, since they were both officially men's prisons. Even though from accounts I've read at the time, there were maybe 4 or 5 women at a time around the time at Walla Walla, and they kept them segregated. But again, it was like makeshift quarters, and they really had nowhere to go but their cells. Like they couldn't circulate in the buildings or in the yards because that was all the domain of the male prisoners. And parading women around would just cause a fucking riot. Excuse my French. They also didn't have uniforms. They just had to wear whatever they came with. So it's just kind of an interesting situation.
Yeah. So what happened to Georgia Allen?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I am currently, again, waiting on an archives request to see if I can find out if and when she was released. So I promise I will update if and when I find out anything else about Georgia Allen. But that's all I know for now.
Yeah, for sure. That's rough. This is all pretty rough.
Yeah. I think about, all these women were leading like hard lives and struggling probably with addiction and related afflictions such as TB with Myrtle Baker. But at the same time, they were, really kind of like exhibiting some agency in the ways they had taken control of their lives or were trying to take control, in ways that were maybe more commonly accepted or attributed to men. So, they were doing their thing.
Yeah. So it sounds like maybe a time where maybe agency for women was taken a little bit harsher, I guess, or definitely given less agency. Do we see any more examples of that in the Bellingham history books?
Yes, and we have another story about a woman criminal, quote unquote, who was basically criminalized for being a woman who was also a barber.
Oh, God.
Because, touching men and being close to men in this lathering kind of situation was clearly.
Well, so we'll see you all next week for our XXX rated barber episode.
More female trouble on the way.
All right. See you next week for more Bad Town.
We had some bonus questions about this episode, so we'll add those in here.
Okay. Our next questions have to do with episode 6. This episode is our Bad Lady Town episode where we told stories of lady criminals, aka the baddest bitches of Bad Town. Sylvia and Izzy want to know if there are any female murderers from Bellingham who murdered with their own hands.
Right. So that's referring to the case in one of those episodes, episode 6, I guess, in which it was a Patton murder, in which the woman commanded her son to shoot her neighbor, Michael Patton. And I can't really speak to much like from the 60s onward, but basically all the murderers that I can think of that come to mind are women who killed their abusive husband, which goes all the way back to, say, Indigenous woman Zuilas Sehome Fitzhugh, who shot her asshole third husband, who was a Welsh guy. Fitzhugh was, we talked about this, I think, maybe in the Sehome Mine episode, I'm not sure, but he married Sehome's daughter, Julia, and Zuilas was her aunt, who actually came to help her when she was pregnant. She was having a hard pregnancy. And then Fitzhugh knocked her aunt up as well and ditched them both and went off to fight for the South during the Civil War. What a guy. But she married a couple more times after that. And her third husband was a total a-hole as well. and everybody knew about it. So when she shot him, she got a pretty lenient sentence for the time. And that's a pretty terrible story. There's another sort of similar one in Mount Vernon. I think Todd Warger writes about a case in one of his books. It's in Skagit County of Jenny Gorsuch, who shot her abusive husband. She was also sentenced to Walla Walla, was given a sympathetic sort of lenient sentence there. So depressing.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I would say that the See Home Fitzhugh murder makes me feel like someone needs to write a murder ballad about her, like an old fashioned murder ballad where you're kind of like, is this song celebrating her or warning us about the whole situation or both or everything? Yes, it is. It's like, yeah.
And I had a hard time, finding any historical statistics, and I think that just bears out in the fact that there weren't jails or accommodations in jails for women because they were not getting arrested as often for one reason or another.
And to your point too, there's, when you have a society or a culture that's like to Izzy's earlier question about what are the pros and cons of being a woman who's married and not married, or to be an old maid, it's like, well, you're less likely to be murdered. I think we often think that women have more protection by having a man in the home, but you're actually much more likely to be murdered by the man in your home than you are anybody else.
Well, surprise, surprise, our next question is about female bootleggers. Do we have any?
I'm just going to say, it depends on what you mean by bootlegger, because that term, I think, gets thrown around in different ways. And today probably has a lot more general meaning and perhaps a slightly different meaning than it did originally. But there probably weren't actually people walking around with bottles in their boots, so to say. Maybe occasionally. But anyway, bootlegging in terms of there were lots of women arrested and incarcerated for violations of liquor laws. Huge. That was why we ended up with needing a women's jail. That and outlawing the brothels was, it just tripled the need.
Yeah.
So
everyone just was being hospitable. They were just offering alcohol. And,
Well, yeah.
And
the brothels had always served booze, and they were run by women historically, so they kept on doing that. And so a lot of the times all through the 1920s, brothel busts were often actually liquor busts. So you'd see it written up in the paper where it was they raided this brothel, but they arrested them on liquor charges. So it's interesting. I think women tended to be more in the in the selling role rather than on the smuggling or producing end of the.
Well, that all just sounds too complicated. Operating a still or driving a car, it's hard for us ladies to make things like that happen.
Yeah, and that was probably just because of the way the gender roles were already falling out. But that's just what you see the arrests for.
Okay, we have another question from Sylvia, who asks, "Doesn't it seem unfair that the lady sneaking the saws into the male prisoners got a much larger amount of time, so I'm guessing a much longer sentence, than any of the male prisoners she was trying to aid?"
Well, yeah, but that's how it is, sister. We're always going to be.
Well, this is just who I was thinking of, right? When I was talking about smuggling and skirts, this immediately came into my mind because she literally smuggled in 12 saws or some crazy thing in her skirts and stuff. But yeah, why the heck? I guess they were just drug dealers, and, I don't honestly think that they should have been in jail in the first place. But yeah, if she was trying to break out murderers or something, I feel like whatever prisoner she was abetting, that's their sentence or whatever their crime they were accused of should reflect on her.
It's obviously more about her gender than anything else, which I think Sylvia's being really smart to tap into. It's it has a lot more to do with punishing her as a woman for doing something wrong and trying to set an example for other women about, and I think some of it comes along. It's oh, we didn't even consider that this was something that a woman would do, and now we need to really punish her so that all the other women don't get uppity and put stuff uppity their skirt. We have to really we have to really, think about and be, and this is really constant in our history. We have countless examples of women being treated in a completely different way than men are treated for doing the same thing, and being treated and there being this extra level of how dare you kind of rot on a woman as well.
Okay, so this is, I think, our last question from Sylvia. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for sending in so many thoughtful questions. She wants to know, what happened to the brothel lady's rival?
Yes. Okay. So in this episode we talked about Madame Myrtle Baker and her rival, who get into a little scrap, and her rival's name was Eva Holman. And honestly, I don't know, Eva Holman's name appeared in local directories for a couple more years until around 1913. And then she moved on to greener pastures. And wherever she went, she likely used a different name, because it's an old brick wall in the searchable records with the info that we have on her.
Maybe she got married.
Could be, but I often find marriage records.
Right.
I mean, but she likely, Eva Holman, may not have been her real name. The ages she gave may not be her real age. Where she was born is probably not the real thing. So it's really hard to research these people. And actually, the reason why we had so much on Myrtle Baker was because she was a property owner. So, and she died, and she left it to her sister, and it left this whole paper trail.
And Myrtle Baker was married, and I wonder if her husband had to co-sign on all of her mortgages.
That's a good question.
Because, sometimes I'm like, why do these ladies stay with these dum-dums that they're with? I mean, I say that in modern times for lots of reasons, but,
no, that's a really good point, actually. Because, I know the same thing. She's clearly super not cool with him a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, if you need someone to sign your important financial paperwork, it's good to have a dum-dum around.
All right. Any thoughts about this episode today in 2023, Ren?
I have thoughts, but probably the same ones I had when I heard these stories. But it's always nice to revisit some of our old lady friends. But yeah, the story of Paddon has always stuck with me. And I'm not sure why. I think it just illustrates how desperate life could be, how isolated and how helpless one could feel. Anyone, but I mean, especially women. And I can't even imagine how tragic and frightening that would have been for her son. But then to be put in an institution amongst men, and we've talked about the conditions of these prisons, as we said in previous episodes, where they're already held in these horrific conditions, and then you're held in horrific conditions that aren't meant for you. You're just thrown in with these people. It's just insane. So I can only imagine that for her, death was a far better option.
God.
Yeah, like you said, I know, we had a little pre-warning. These are the darker tales of women here.
Yes.
In Whatcom, but really, it just kind of hit home. That one always just gives me the chills.
Me too. And I do have an update for this one on Georgia Allen, who attempted to smuggle the saws and guns and bullets into the prisoners in the Whatcom County Jail.
She was not thinking things through completely.
I'm still thinking about those saws, because they did call them hacksaws, but I'm like, are we talking little files?
I know.
Or
I think of the blade that goes on the saw, right? So she just put that in?
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure that one out.
I know.
Anyway.
It's food for thought.
So when we did these episodes, it was pandemic, and it was difficult to do archival research at the time. And, locally to get out to an archive, they just weren't open. But even, a lot of the times I'll do a research request for, California state archives or whatever for the prison records there. And they weren't open either. So you couldn't even, get very much done.
Just the basics.
A lot of the archives were just closed. So I had put in a research request to get her prisoner files, I believe from Walla Walla. And they did end up sending them to me, but it was 6 months later after we had recorded this. And so I remember reading through them, and they're super fascinating, but we had never gotten a chance to do an update.
Revisit. How would we?
So let's do that now.
Yes.
So the prison records are really interesting. So it's just basically like a file. Imagine there's a file cabinet in the administrative offices at the prison where just like any correspondence related to that prisoner, everything just gets filed in there. Okay. So it's a hodgepodge of files and documents and letters. And so they scanned all that and sent it.
Oh my God.
And so, yeah, there's the official intake questionnaires. There's letters from her mother and various like law enforcement agencies communicating about her parole status and all that. So she did have to serve her minimum. She was sentenced to 1 year minimum, 10-year maximum.
Oh, okay.
So she had to serve the minimum. So she had to serve a year in Walla Walla. And after that, she was eligible for parole, which she was granted. But there was a lot of correspondence about it because, it was like, is she a good candidate? Like, should we parole her? All of this. But also to get parole. So I found this was really interesting. They have what they called at the time, and I don't know if it's still called this, but the term was first friend. You'd have to have a first friend who's kind of like your sponsor. So, like, when you get out of prison, they're your first friend, and they're going to give you employment and a place to live and, like, be a good influence on you.
Okay.
And then be willing to communicate with the prison that, like, yes, regularly, like, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're working for me and blah, blah, blah.
First friend. That sounds very wholesome
and I know,
friendly.
Yeah. Like we were talking about ear hustle, like they have to like have you have to really have your ducks lined up to be paroled, to get out. Like you have to have a whole plan.
Right.
So that's essentially what's happening, right?
Interesting.
But she was 19, I think, at the time.
No shit.
She was living at home. Her parents were from Vancouver, BC.
Aww.
And so she had never, she followed these dudes down to Washington, and she had the hots for one of them. And that was in the letters too, where the sheriff is like, I believe, she was swayed by her, being in love with this man who like convinced her to do things she shouldn't have, and she didn't realize what she was doing. And she's a good candidate for parole. So they're saying all this, but bear in mind, Georgia, the 19-year-old, has like multiple tattoos.
Yeah. She's a little wild child.
She's smuggling guns and saws into a prison.
She's not the girl next door.
Yes. I thought her handwriting was very lovely because there are letters that are written and signed by her in there.
But it wasn't everyone's lovely back in the day.
I mean,
if you knew how to read and write.
I will say that Police Chief Al Callahan was barely literate. Could hardly read it. And his spelling was atrocious.
Okay.
So I was like, okay,
all right, Chief. Georgia.
Mm-hmm. So Georgia seemed like, she said she only had an 8th grade education in the intake form. Mm-hmm. She said she's a smoker. She had smoked since she was 15, cigarettes. Okay. Which is also like, cigarettes are like, kind of edgy at the time. Okay. Like they were not mainstream.
Yeah, okay, right. We're not talking like 30s,
and like
40s.
Everybody smoked cigars, right? But like cigarettes, in fact, they were like banned in Bellingham like in 1908 for like a year. It was illegal. Yeah. It was very weird. Cigarettes have a whole history.
Oh my God. Okay, that's another podcast. Yeah. Wow.
So,
okay.
And she stated her health was poor. Oh, she denied being an opioid user, which the men she was aiding and abetting were there for being dealers and smugglers of opium.
Yeah.
And so I have a feeling she's lying about that.
Okay.
But she stated she has also never used intoxicating liquors.
Oh, girl, come on.
She said her health was poor. The only illnesses they listed like so many illnesses and were like, have you ever had, XYZ? She had diphtheria and measles. And then she put possibly for gonorrhea.
Lord. Oh boy. Okay. But I've never drank a drop of alcohol. I got the gonorrhea.
I know.
Oh, Lord.
I was like, oh, dear girl.
Georgia.
So then there was an interesting bunch of correspondence with a bunch of Bellingham women who I think that she was trying to say, would he be my first friend and like kind of sponsor me?
Dang it.
And neither of those women could or would do it for whatever reason.
Okay.
So I don't know why. That they're like some of the correspondence, you only have the one side of it. So it's just like, I don't know what's happening. But so then there's a lot of letters from her mother, and her mother's name was Isabel or Belle. And she was like, please let me be my daughter's first friend. And she's very eloquent. nice handwriting.
Huh.
But the problem is that she's older and she lives in Vancouver. And she's just like, can you please give us permission for her to be paroled
In
to
Vancouver.
me here in Canada?
Yeah.
And at first they were like, nope, because, that's
This was
kind
a
of how
major
it works.
crime,
Like
and
parole, you have to
she's
be
here.
in Washington. And so I think she was trying to find someone in Bellingham,
Oh, no.
to do that and couldn't. But they did eventually decide that she could go to her mother.
Okay. All right.
So she ends up being released to her mother. And the parole forms are really interesting, too, because those are in there. So she has to fill out these monthly forms.
Of what she's doing.
Yeah.
Oh, my
and
gosh.
so it's like, how much have you earned? What are your expenditures?
Oh, wow.
And I was a little bit suspicious of that, too, because she just has these nice round numbers. Like, she's like, $10. I spent $5 on shoes.
Oh, yeah.
And that's it.
Well, there's nobody's going to hunt that down. It's not like today.
No. There's no paper trail. She can say whatever.
Yeah.
But I was just like, I'd put like $3.99 or something like
Yeah,
this. These numbers just seem a little too pat and like, I don't know. But, and then she writes what she's been reading and what she's been doing.
Wow.
And so like
That's
her, in her
cool.
evenings.
That's neat. Okay, what did she say?
So she's
what bullshit did she
she's
make
like,
up?
I am sewing and reading,
Well, of
and I
course.
am hanging out at home with family and visiting friends
Uh-huh.
and going to church. Of course. Again, it just is very
Love
much like
Georgia.
she's telling them what
Of
they
course.
want.
Well, yeah, that's what you would do.
She says she is reading the works of Shakespeare, various novels,
Okay.
the poems of Lord Byron and Tennyson. She's also reading the daily papers and Cosmopolitan magazine.
Okay.
Which I'm like, now I'm dying to see what was in a Cosmo.
Can we please
in
get some issues?
1913.
1913 Cosmo. Yes. Because that was... she wasn't lying about that one.
I know, I'm like, was it as trashy?
Lord
in
Byron.
1913?
Oh,
Was there,
I know.
like, tips on how to...
7 ways to give your dude head. Sorry, we can cut that
That
out.
was not in there. Not in 1913.
There wasn't some veiled
There's like how to
innuendo.
show some ankle.
Yeah. How to make your skin more white.
Hike those skirts up 2 more inches. Yeah, so from all those documents, I was able to kind of pull together some details about her family life and find out more about what happened to her. And so I'd mentioned her mother, Isabel, who was born in the Channel Islands, which is UK.
Okay.
Weird.
All right.
But she married George's father in Nova Scotia in the 1880s, and they made their way west to BC. He was much older, and he's weirdly, like, not in the records with them a lot, even though I have his death record. I don't know
So
where
he was
he was.
around.
He was somewhere.
Okay.
But
And they weren't divorced.
not that I can tell.
Okay.
But don't know what was going on with him. But she had an older brother named Roderick. And so the father, not sure what's going on. The one census I found him in, he was listed as a carpenter. And then the mother and the children are on their own. And the next one, it just says married. So I don't know where he's at. But he is buried. He died in 1922. He and Georgia are buried together in the same cemetery lot.
Oh.
Unmarked graves.
Oh.
Which is interesting.
In BC.
Yes. Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver.
Oh.
And then Georgia's brother, Roderick, died in 1924 in the Essendale Mental Hospital.
Oh, man.
But he is buried with their mother, Isabel, at Ocean View Burial Park in Burnaby.
Huh.
So they both have headstones that say, like, beloved son.
Oh, shoot.
And Isabel had a sister that lived in BC.
Okay.
She was the last of the whole family to die.
Really?
So I'm assuming the sisters provided her headstone.
I was going to say, after the husband and Georgia died.
Georgia was the first to go.
Oh,
So,
man.
poor Georgia. She didn't make it very long after gaining her freedom.
Oh.
She died in 1919. So,
Dang.
that's 6 years after she was
6 years
paroled.
of reading Cosmo and
Right.
Tennyson.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
I could not find an obituary or anything stating the cause of her death, but it's limited what is online from Vancouver. But her burial records, her name, interestingly, so her birth name was Georgina, which is cute.
That's very cute.
But at the time of her death, her surname is listed as Yuen Gong. which is written as all one word, but I'm pretty sure that is a recording error. I think that is the Chinese name's Yuan Gong, 2 words, which maybe that's her husband's name.
So she married then? Maybe.
Couldn't find a record.
You might not be able to because of
the misspelling of the name, and which was very common with Asian names. Because Asian names too, it would be like family name would be listed first traditionally.
Oh gosh.
And so there's a lot of the names get mixed around, and what's the first name? What's the last name? We're so confused. We don't understand. And anyway, but also they just spell them terribly and misspell them all the time. So it's very hard.
Interesting. But clearly she had a new name.
Yeah. I don't know. Yes, I hate to even speculate, but given her history, I suspect there was some opium going on there.
That was
it was I looked because I knew like interracial marriage was a huge hot button topic at this time, and there were a lot of articles about white women and Chinese men getting married, and they were trying to actually legislate against it in Canada. And so I was like hoping to find some mention of her, but I couldn't find anything about her specifically. But there was a lot just say that was probably like, I don't think her parents would have been.
Yeah. She wasn't living at home and visiting with family
probably
at that point.
Not.
Yeah.
And I also did find one newspaper article from her first marriage, because her name was Georgia Allen, which is not her birth name. So she was Georgia McDonald is her birth name.
Interesting.
So her dad was Donald McDonald.
Oh, wow.
But
wow.
But so she married a guy named James Allen when she was quite young. And so during the time where she's incarcerated, her name is Georgia Allen. She's still married to that guy. So why is she
smuggling saws to
some other dudes in prison?
Okay.
But when I found this article, so it was they had like having domestic dispute basically, and were in court asking for divorce.
Okay.
Or she was pressing charges against him because he gave her a very large black eye. Which they described in the article. And it sounded like a pretty sad situation, but the article, so disgusting. Like, they're very snarky about it. And like, well, the husband said, he went out to eat breakfast and he came back to the hotel and there was another man in the bed. And that's why he gave his wife a black eye. And then they're just like, of course.
Yeah.
And so, he did I think he was sentenced to 6 weeks in the jail or something.
Right.
But it didn't paint a picture of a happy life. Yeah. And I almost wondered if there was like opium use going on, if he was trafficking her.
Yeah, in a hotel.
Yeah, it just, there's a lot of things. I'm like, they weren't telling the full story, obviously, in that article, so.
Interesting that there was an article about it.
Right.
Huh.
And they were kind of like, oh, these people are, in public with their dirty laundry and their black eye, and they've only been married a short time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah. No. So she divorced him
at
some
must
point.
Have. Yeah, I couldn't find, again, any records, or I couldn't even find anything about him. They did describe him in that article as having shifty eyes.
I know. We love to just, oh my God. Paint the pictures, man. Like... We got weird criminal head shapes, and we got eyeballs that are shifty.
The article, it's very much like, look at these trashy people.
Yeah, and they're probably alluding to that he's on drugs.
Yeah.
Like he's probably pretty shifty.
Yes. Oh, so my gut feeling, I mean, we can't say for sure, obviously, but like from my own experiences on the streets and with people who are addicted, I think Georgia's probably an opium addict.
Georgia was already gone.
Yeah.
Before she got here to Bellingham.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
it's
not very happy.
And she's the first to go.
But
how old is her mom when she goes?
She lived I think into like the late 20s.
Okay. So not a whole lot longer.
No, they all kind of died right in a row, but obviously the children were much younger.
Dang.
Yeah.
Oh, Georgia.
Yeah.
The Donald McDonald.
I know.
From Nova Scotia. Sorry, Donald. Oh my God. Rest in peace.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, that's a really cool update though.
Yeah.
That's so cool to like have all of that
Yeah.
interesting
I'll try to
stuff
put
from her
some
file.
of the stuff from the files on the show notes.
Yeah.
Because it's very fun.
Let's do that.
And
oh my God. But yeah, I'm glad we were able to update on that. That's so interesting. Good work, Colby.
Yeah.
As usual.
Oh my God.
All right.
Well, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, let's, I guess, I suppose. That wraps up our episode.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man hits without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad, to listen to that old time music.
As usual, we'd like to thank you all for listening to Belling History with the Good Time Girls. Do subscribe and review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms. Like us on all the social medias. Check out our tours and events. Read our show notes and blog. All of that at bellinghistory.com.
Most of the time, Lucas loves you blue. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat, I lost my brim. I look like crows just swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
And we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song, Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers tunes and Devin Champlin's tunes on Bandcamp, and you can find Devin at Champlin Guitars in Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad to listen to that old time music.
All right, see you next time.
For more Belling history.
Oh, yeah.
Bad Town.
Bad Town.
Dun, 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 dun.
Thank you.